So I want to have us look at Matthew 22 this morning. You can turn in your Bibles there if you have a Bible in front of you. Matthew chapter 22. And I want to begin with this question as you're turning there. If Jesus was living in America today, what would he be thinking about our politicians? What would he think of Barack Obama? What would he think of Hillary Clinton? What would he think of Donald Trump? What would he be thinking right now? It's a fascinating question, especially if you know what happened this weekend. 2 bombshells dropped basically simultaneously. The first one being the leak of a video or audio excerpt from Donald Trump talking with another guy. I guess he either didn't realize it was being recorded or something, or didn't care back then. I think it was 10 or 11 years ago. And probably most of you have seen or heard about this by now. But if you haven't, he said some pretty offensive things about women and about how he likes to basically take advantage of them because of his power and his celebrity status, and talked about basically groping them and touching them and things like that. And it's extremely offensive. And as you can imagine, the media has jumped all over that and has been putting it out there often ever since the story broke, I think on Friday. So that was one bombshell. The other one, which hasn't had as much attention, is related to the Hillary Clinton camp. Some WikiLeaks, I guess, emails that were hacked, and this has not been verified yet, but it seems as though even the way the Clinton party is handling this, or the Clinton staffers are handling this, is seemingly indicating that there's some truth to this. But it's a leak of different things that she said when she had those private meetings in which she was paid lots of money to speak to Wall Street groups. And in the comments that were released, it was clear that all this that everyone seems to already know, we kind of know this about both of them already, but what's coming out is she's made statements that make it clear that she has kind of one public persona and one public policy, and she has a very different private persona and private policy. So the whole two-faced thing has come out in sort of an illustrative way with this release. So those were 2 significant bombshells this weekend. Again, you probably already know about them. If you are anything like me, you spend probably too much time paying attention to those things. If you don't know anything about this, God bless you. You're way better off. But if you've taken the time to read the articles and watch the videos, then you've suffered like me, and you've thought, gosh, what is happening? What is going on? And as I was looking at this passage, which in God's providence is about politicians and Jesus' view of them, I thought, what would he be thinking right now? I mean, he exists right now. He's in heaven. He's thinking something. But I mean, if he was living here as a citizen, what would he be thinking? How would he be living? How would he be talking about these people? It's an interesting question. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at Matthew 22. I'm going to walk you through some verses here, verse 15 to 22, explain the passage a bit, say some things about it. And then secondly, I want to give you and this will be really interesting, I want to give you a little bio on Tiberius, who was Caesar at the very time Jesus made the comments he makes in Matthew 22, 15 to 22. I'll tell you some things about Tiberius Caesar. And then thirdly, I'm going to share with you some insights, some implications drawn from what we've looked at in this passage to help you frame your thoughts. I'm never going to tell you who to vote for, but I want to give you some biblical thinking to help balance you and anchor you as you think through the next month in who you're going to vote for and how you're going to handle it. So I want to do that last, okay? So let's begin with the passage, and before I read it, I want to set it up. Okay, the context is Jesus has been interacting with the religious leaders. That's what's happening from chapter 21 on to the end of chapter 23. This is back and forth. As usual, they come to him, they're questioning him, they're challenging his authority. They frankly want to seize him and put an end to him. They want to completely eliminate him and, wipe him off the face of the earth, frankly. But they're afraid of the people. They know he has some popularity, and so in this context, they are basically settling for trying to trap him. And this is the last week of his life, so they will succeed here in the near future. This is the last week of Jesus' earthly life. And that's what they're up to. And he is, in a sense, arguing with them. He is sharing parables which reveal the essence of their problem, which is self-righteousness, their rejection of God's grace. He shares several parables, and we've looked at them in the previous weeks to basically expose them, and they're realizing what's happening. They're realizing that he is making them look bad, and that's why they're even more infuriated right now, and that's why this whole controversy has reached kind of a fever pitch here, is because of that exposure that Jesus has brought upon them, which they didn't want. So now, in that context, read verse 15 on to verse 22 with me. It says, "Then the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, 'Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not?' But Jesus perceived their malice and said, 'Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax.' And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, 'Whose likeness and inscription is this?' They said to him, 'Caesar's.' Then he said to them, 'Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' And hearing this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away." They're trying to trap Jesus. They're asking him a question that puts him in a really difficult spot between a rock and a hard place. Notice they send, this time it's not the Pharisees themselves, but they send their disciples, their pupils, to question Jesus, along with a group called the Herodians. Both groups made up of primarily Jewish people. The first group, the disciples of the Pharisees, were obviously loyal to the religious leaders and were thinking on a very religious wavelength. The Herodians were the political loyalists, the ones who were loyal to Herod, who was the leader over Judea, over the Jewish people who had been appointed by the Roman emperor, the Roman Caesar. So you have a religious group and a political group, and now what they want to do is put Jesus in a catch-22 to where he has to alienate one of the two groups by answering this question. So they ask him, and by the way, let me stop. They notice the flattery. They say, "Teacher, we know that you're truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any." In other words, you're not a compromiser. You don't just say what people want to hear. You speak truth. They're buttering him up. This whole thing is strategic. Sending the disciples in the first place instead of the Pharisees going themselves was strategic in terms of, well, maybe we can kind of bring down his defenses a little bit. Maybe we can play to his sympathies a little bit, and he'll ease up, or he won't be thinking as sharply, and then they can pounce on him with this good question. And they set up the question with this false flattery, which they don't really believe. And Jesus will explain or expose that a little bit later in the passage. But look at verse 17. "Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not?" This was a huge controversy in their day. The Jewish people believed that God was their true leader. And in one sense, that was a fact. But part of that was their disapproval, their rebellion, their hostility toward the Roman leaders. Their belief that the Romans were oppressive and were taking advantage of them, and they wanted freedom, and that's why they wanted the Messiah to come along and give them freedom. Well, one of the sore spots for them was this tax issue. There were various taxes in those days, just like today, and one of them was called a poll tax. It was basically a head count tax. It was like related to the census that was taken on a regular basis. You had to pay a tax just for living there in the Roman Empire, and it was based on every single individual who was living there. And because of all the other taxes they had, they resented it. And because they believed God was their true leader, they felt they didn't really have to pay this tax. Most of them would. They'd sort of bite their tongue and pay the tax, but they resented it. They hated it, okay? On the other hand, the Herodians would have been all in favor of that tax because it puts more money in the hands of the Roman leaders, and they were loyal to the Roman leaders, Roman government, okay? So you can kind of sense the situation here. It's pretty tense. And they're trying to get him caught in the middle and make him alienate one group or the other. And so Jesus, as usual, with his perfect wisdom, responds, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites?" In other words, you say one thing, do another. You're one thing on the outside, you're something different on the inside. Even their flattery here, he knows is completely false. He sees right through it. And he says, and this is brilliant, show me the coin used for the poll tax. And they brought him a denarius, a Roman coin. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And he held up the coin, and he probably went like that with it, because on both sides there were pictures of Tiberius Caesar, the Roman ruler. The first side was a picture of just his head, and it says, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. The second side was a smaller image of Tiberius on a throne, and the words, highest priest. He holds that coin up and shows it to them. He says, whose image is on this coin? And they said to him, verse 21, Caesar's. Then he said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. He says, if his picture's on the coin, then pay him his taxes. Literally in the Greek language, the word render is give back. Give back to him what is his. There's a sense in which they were living as citizens of the Roman Empire, and they were benefiting from everything from the roads to the police who were available to help when things got out of hand, to the court systems, all provision, all requiring government and money to make it work. And Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And here's what's interesting about this. He is not believing this presents a real catch-22 or a quandary. He doesn't believe it's either or. He doesn't believe it's either honor Caesar or honor God. What he says here essentially is, you honor God by honoring Caesar. You honor God by honoring Caesar. And a big part of that is pay your taxes. Think about this for a moment. This is staggering. He is encouraging the payment of taxes, which will then go into the hands of the Roman leaders, which allows them to have Roman police officers and guardians and others who attend to the criminals of their society. And what's about to happen a few days from now? Jesus is about to be treated like a criminal, isn't he? He's about to be tried, convicted, and executed. And still here he says, pay into that system. Pay into that system. You probably struggle when you think about paying your taxes because of where you know the money's going and all the liberal agendas or the immoral agendas being pushed by our government these days, frankly, in both parties. Jesus knew full well what was happening. And he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And hearing this, verse 22, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. I mean, as was so often the case, and he silenced them. There's nothing they could say, because he didn't pick a side per se. He said it's not either or, it's both. And in fact, his answer revealed that the religious people were thinking of it wrongly, and the political people were thinking of it wrongly too. The religious people ignored the idea of honoring the Caesar, and the political people ignored the idea of honoring God. So it was a perfect answer, as always with him. He says, it's not honor God or honor Caesar, it's honor God by honoring Caesar. So now, I want to tell you about Tiberius a little bit. Where's Don? Don, you remember this book? We had to read this in seminary. Bring back bad memories of slogging through hundreds of pages of a lot of this not being easy reading. But I picked this up this past week, and I thought, I want to find the contemporary of Jesus. Who was Caesar when Jesus made these statements? And so I read some things about Tiberius, and I want to tell you, in the beginning, the first 10 or so pages, 10 or 15 pages, I was bored. And I was disappointed. I was like, oh man, I was really hoping for some raunchy stuff here in the most appropriate sort of way. Hopefully you can understand that. But it was boring in that he was kind of a modest guy and had policies that seemed fair And he married a woman. It was kind of a neat romantic story, but then that sort of fell apart. He married someone else, which is, that's not good, but still it was pretty sterile for the most part. I read things about his apparent humility. Like Caesars would love to have their busts, right? Statues of just their head and the upper part of their shoulders around the whole empire. And he refused many of the places they wanted to put them, including the temples and all the holy sites. Usually they would want their bust to be in those places because they wanted to be glorified and worshiped as God, but he didn't want to be. In fact, when people called him Lord or Master, he would often rebuke them and tell them not to call him that. And because of things like that and his willingness to visit some of the down and out of the Roman Empire at times, and was even charitable sometimes to people who were less fortunate and people who were sick. I mean, he was a popular guy, and that's largely how this momentum built for him. But I kept reading, and as always happens down here on earth, the truth always comes out. The truth always comes out. I won't give specific examples, but you can think of politicians and actors and actresses and people who are glamorized, and eventually the truth always comes out, doesn't it? And so I kept reading, and I want to give you just a summary. I'm not going to read much of this, frankly, because I can't, because there are children in the room and because you wouldn't want me to. But let me give you a little breakdown, and I want to read a few different sections of this book. He was an alcoholic, drunk for days at a time, engaged in drunken orgies, which of course went along with that back then, and still in many ways. Porn addict. You think, well, there's no internet back then, there's no videos back then, but he had statues and paintings and drawings surrounding him almost all the time. He was a sex addict with men and women, boys and girls, even involving infants at times in completely disgusting ways. There's one example of that I can read to you. It says, the story goes that once while sacrificing, Tiberius took an erotic fancy to the acolyte or the attendant who carried the incense casket and could hardly wait for the ceremony to end before hurrying him and his brother, the sacred trumpeter, out of the temple and indecently assaulting them both. When they jointly protested at his disgusting behavior, he had their legs broken. He was exceedingly violent. In fact, they said he had a lust to see people suffer. He liked to torture people who questioned him and crossed him. He had a huge ego. Despite the fact he didn't like to be worshipped, it turned out that was more because he didn't consider himself a religious person. He was more into astrology and things like that. So it was more related to that way of thinking, even though maybe people would have thought, oh, he's being modest. Well, it just turns out he had different motives. There's a story in here about his conversations he would have at his dinner table with his officials and other philosophers. He would invite all these high-ranking people. It says that at the dinner table, he used to pose questions arising from his daily study. Seleucus, a professor of literature, had been finding out from the imperial servants what books he was reading and came prepared with all the right answers. Hearing of this, Tiberius dismissed him from the company and later forced him to commit suicide. He didn't want anyone to one-up him. He didn't want to look dumb in front of him. He had to beat everybody. He had to look smarter. And if you came prepared with the answers and he couldn't wax eloquent in the way that he wanted to, he resented that. And this guy even forced him to commit suicide. One final excerpt, and while I'm turning there, I'll just tell you, he was also lazy. A lot of the projects he started, he didn't complete. They were half-built buildings and things like that. He was cheap. He was known for meager wages for the people who served him. And then finally, one section here about his death. When he finally died, the news of his death caused such a joy at Rome that the people ran about in the streets yelling, "To the Tiber with Tiberius." The Tiber is a river. And others offered prayers to Mother Earth and the infernal gods to give him no home below except among the damned. Curse him. It's an understandable response, right? After all the horrible things that he did. And I just gave you a little tiny smidgen of it. Horrible, horrible things, sexually and in terms of torturing and mutilating people. And it went on and on and on. And when he died, the people said, Thank God he's gone. To hell with him. That's the guy who was in power when Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. We have a way of whitewashing the past, kind of glamorizing the past. We do it all the time. Looking back at good traditional values of America and other things, we like to look back and say, well, it was so much better then. The reality is, look, human nature has always been the same. There's nothing new under the sun. It's nothing new. This is what humans do. And this is what humans do, particularly when they are given power and money. And people serve them in the ways that they want. This is what happens. It's nothing new. And Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar. In Romans 13, turn to Romans 13 with me for a minute. Paul expounds upon this idea in Romans 13. And the book of Romans was written later. There was another Caesar in power. May have been Nero by the time Romans was written. I'll tell you, he's no better than Tiberius. And here's what Paul writes in Romans 13, verses 1 to 8. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Notice what he adds to the list. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. I mean, it doesn't make sense to honor Tiberius, to honor Nero, to honor Barack Obama, to honor Hillary Clinton, to honor Donald Trump. You may say, I don't have to honor him yet. He's not president yet. And his chances are not looking good at this point. It really doesn't matter. Did you notice there in Romans 8, at the end, he says, we've been loved by God, is what he gets into. He says, so just love. You owe nothing to anyone else except this, that you love one another. And then he goes on to say, this is fulfilled, this is the law. This is the whole essence of what God calls you to. As someone who's been loved by him. So there's some loose ends I want to tie up here, and I'll do that in the last section of this message, in which I want to talk to you about some Christ-centered thoughts, insights, hopefully that will help you think through this a little bit more. First of all, Jesus isn't surprised when news like what broke Friday breaks. He's not surprised. And we ought not be surprised either. As I said, there's nothing new under the sun. Jesus in Matthew 22, he saw right through their motives when they were questioning him. He saw right through Tiberius. He knew all about that guy. And it doesn't change his response, his way of thinking, and his way of living. It didn't change. He's not surprised by the horrible stuff that comes out of humans. He knows what fallen nature is like better than we humans do. We like to clean it up on the outside, whether that's in a religious sense or an irreligious sense. We've got the religious people with all their self-righteous endeavors and movements, and then you've got the irreligious people with their sort of utopian view that we can bring into the world, a utopian society, if we can just do the let live and let live thing, and they have their own agenda. But human nature, if God doesn't do something to rescue us from ourselves, is horrible, evil, dark. It is dead. Dead. Jesus saw through it. Jesus wasn't surprised. He isn't surprised today. And the more we see him, the more clearly we see him, the more we shouldn't be either, because we start seeing more of ourselves. And in many ways, and really in every way, we are cut from entirely the same cloth as the people whom we so quickly want to condemn and attack. So second point, we are no better. Listen, you should be appalled when you hear the types of things that came out on Friday. I have 3 young daughters. I was deeply offended. Deeply offended. And yet it didn't take long throughout that evening for me to be reminded of, in the past and even in the present, the countless ways I'm tempted and at times do objectify women, and even my wife at times, viewing her wrongly. And I will tell you, every honest man walking this earth would say the same thing. And it's interesting, Donald Trump's response has been, well, hey, I said it. Well, he's had several responses, but one of his responses has been, I said it, but Bill Clinton did it. He acted upon it. And that's been a way of kind of deflecting. And I thought, that's the same strategy that we employ all the time. Yeah, well, I had this thought, but I never did that. Or I never said what he said. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go that far. We just create these arbitrary standards for ourselves so that we can get ourselves off the hook. This is reality. And when Jesus comes to town, the truth is seen. And the truth is, apart from God rescuing us from ourselves, this is exactly what we do to other people. We use other people. And for men, in particular heterosexual men, at least in this context, this is what men think and do, apart from miracles of God's grace. And thankfully, those miracles do happen. But they are miracles. And similar to the way Donald Trump sort of embodies or personifies male perversion, we could say in some ways Hillary Clinton kind of personifies female perversion, which at times is different, not always, but at times can be different. Either way, look, you're seeing humankind displayed before you. And what I want for us to consider this morning is that every time we see that, we ought not forget that apart from God rescuing us and giving us His Spirit and putting Christ in us, we are exactly the same. The same. And I think the only hope for us to honor and respect those whom we deem dishonorable is to see ourselves accurately. Thankfully, that's not the end of the story, but if we see ourselves accurately, that's where it begins. The third idea I want to share is and you know this, but we have a better kingdom and a better king. We have a perfect kingdom and a perfect king. Thank God He comes into this world to rescue us like this. Thank God He does. Now, I want to show you one more passage. This is the last one I'm going to turn you to. Matthew 17. And I preached through this weeks and weeks ago now. But it's very similar. And in this passage, we see this idea that there's this kingdom beyond that we belong to, and yet there's a certain way that enables us to live in our earthly kingdom. Verse 24, when they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? He said, yes. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? When Peter said, from strangers, Jesus said to him, then the sons are exempt. However, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea and throw in a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you'll find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and for me. Go pay the tax with the coin that you find in this fish's mouth, which is itself amazing. But what he's getting at here is the idea that kings never charge their sons. They collect taxes from their subjects around the kingdom. They don't charge their own family. And here's what Jesus is getting at. You're in the family of God, Peter. You're in the family of God. Fill in your name here. And that is your kingdom, and that is your citizenship. It says in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven. That is reality. But he says, nevertheless, so that we might not offend, pay the taxes. So seeing that we have that higher kingdom liberates us from the fight that takes place on the inside. If we're fighting to make this country be everything we want it to be, we demand for it to be, It can never be an attitude of honoring the people we disagree with. It just never can be. But to see the kingdom that God has already provided for us, and he says one day we will enjoy in fullness. It's a liberating reality. And he says, and while you're in this world, Peter, pay your taxes. Again, fill in your name here, pay your taxes. And not only that, but custom and honor to whom honor is due. So, I just have written down here, we can be discerning, seeing things as they really are, seeing through politicians, even as we see through ourselves. Being quiet, being respectful, those things are described elsewhere in the New Testament. Do you think a Facebook rant is going to solve the problem? Who thinks a Facebook rant is going to solve the problem? I didn't think so. I didn't see any hands out there. I have friends who are conservative and liberal, and I just see the back and forth volley of just the self-righteous condemning of and it's always condemning the other side. I don't see anybody on there saying, wow, I'm realizing how much of a dirtbag I am. Wow, this whole Donald Trump thing's made me realize, wow, I really view women wrongly. Have you seen any posts like that? I haven't seen any. What I see is everybody else being attacked. And nothing is going to change until all of us look in the mirror and wrestle with the horror of who we are apart from Jesus. But then we see him and we see forgiveness. And we can finally appreciate when God says, I don't hold your sins against you. I don't hold your guilt against you. There's no condemnation for you. You've been loved. And you don't have to carry that burden. You don't have to carry that weight. I've liberated you from it. Now go walk in that freedom and go treat people accordingly, whether that's your spouse or the President of the United States. Do you see how that works? Finally, final point here. Pay and pray. Okay? Pay the taxes and pray. I lied to you earlier. 1 Timothy 2. See, I'm a liar too, just like the politicians. 1 Timothy 2. And I promise you, this is the last one. Hopefully you're enjoying this as much as I am. In which case, it doesn't matter. All right. 1 Timothy 2. Listen to what Paul tells Timothy. First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God, our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. Pray. Pray for Barack Obama. Pray for Donald Trump. Pray for Hillary Clinton. So vote. Vote according to how you educate yourself. And I would encourage you to educate yourself. And there's some people here you could talk to that could help you educate yourself when it comes to the issues. No going in. Look, there's no righteous candidate. Till Jesus comes and touches down, there isn't going to be a righteous leader on earth. That being said, I do believe, and I'm sure you believe, there are certain policies that are better for people, that better fit with the character of God, with the nature of God's love, that better fit with freedom, that better protect those who are weak. There are many issues to consider. There's even a third party to consider, believe it or not, that you can talk to Mikkel about. She'll be happy to inform you. But it's time to start thinking outside of the box, the normal boxes of just picking a team and going to war. It's time to just think carefully. And there are nuances and levels to this, and you dig into politicians' viewpoints, and there's just different layers to them. It can be hard, but we walk by faith through it. We trust God knows, God has a plan. We vote because we have the opportunity to vote. But at the end of the day, our hope is not found in any person here or any party here or any election here. Our hope is in King Jesus. And he has once again made it clear how great he is.